I'm going to show you the running stitch, I'm going to show you the whip stitch, and I'm going to show you something called couching. So once you've chosen your background fabric and your batting, and this is just a sample so it's not to scale, but the first thing that you're going to want to do is a quick running stitch around the edge, and that's really just to baste your edges together. You may keep that or you may not. This thread that I'm using is just a 50 weight cotton thread. This brand is Cotton and Steel, which is lovely, but also quite pricey, but really any cotton thread. Ideally, you want the fiber to match whatever fabric you're working with, so cotton on cotton, wool on wool, although it's most important that you're using natural materials with natural materials or synthetic with synthetic. So one of the shifts that you can make in your thinking that makes it easier to thread your needle is, instead of thinking of it as threading your needle, think of it as needling your thread. So you want to hold your thread really close to the edge and go ahead and lick it. And then you are going to take your needle and just put your needle onto the thread and pull it through. Be sure you make a knot at the end of your thread before you start stitching. I'm not marking out my lines, I'm just going to wing this, but I'm going to eyeball in maybe a generous 1/4 inch. So for a running stitch, you want to have the top of the stitch and the bottom of the stitch about the same length. And actually that's true and not true, because sometimes you want to have a bigger stitch with a smaller increment between the stitches. Really what you want is consistency. So you'll just continue, ideally loading 3 or 4 stitches before pulling your needle through. And there shouldn't be any resistance here. You don't want to be fighting your fabric. It's one of the nice things about working with. This is a kind of loosely woven cotton and a cotton batting, is it just pulls through in a really gentle and easy way. So you're going to continue with that all the way around the 4 sides. So in addition to using the running stitch with a very thin thread to establish an edge, you can also use it as a decorative stitch. All right, so I'm going to make a knot again at the end of my needle. And what I'm thinking about now is maybe creating some parallel lines of running stitch. So I'm going to start in the same way, and right now I'm not really going to overthink the shape that I'm making, but I am going to aim for a bigger stitch with a smaller interval. So you can see what that looks like for comparison. Again, aiming to load maybe 3 stitches of this length at a time. And then maybe I want to come and do a parallel line with that stitch. So now I'm going to make 1 more stitch, but I'm going to angle over. Now I want to have these stitches alternate, so when I angle over to come back up, I'm going to come up halfway through the last stitch I made instead of right next to it. So now when I go to make the running stitch in the opposite direction, it'll be like brick, it'll be offset in rows instead of lined up. And that's the effect that I'm aiming for here. Adding lots of running stitch is a really great way to create textures, to create shapes, and to build layers. Ultimately, quilting is a running stitch, but running stitches are also used in many other cultures. In Japan, the sashiko stitch, also the kanta stitch. So it's really a basic but wonderfully versatile technique. The next stitch that I want to show is something called whip stitch, but before that I just wanted to point out I came back and added some perpendicular running stitches to intersect those parallel lines I had started with, and you can see how it really adds to the effect and makes it more dimensional. It also starts to create some shadows and highlights with the fabric as it's dimpled with the stitching. You can imagine if that was done with a matching thread, it would really just create a textured surface, whereas here it's creating a lot of contrast. So whip stitch is a really great stitch for applique. Applique is just sewing one shape down on top of a background. And there are lots of ways that you can do it. I'm going to show you what's called raw edged applique, which means I'm not turning the edge under. So if I was doing a turned edge applique, I would actually use this needle to tuck my edge and stitch along the fold as I go. That is a really awesome technique, but it's a little bit more, requires a little bit more practice. This shape is in wool, and because it's a complex shape, it's got a cutout in the middle. Working with wool is really helpful because your edges won't fray. So I've got my shape cut out and laid down, and you can use freezer paper. You can iron freezer paper after you've drawn your shape on it to the back of your wool and cut it out and then peel that freezer paper off, and that allows you to get these kind of fussy shapes. It stabilizes the fabric. All right, so for a whip stitch, I'm working with a high contrast thread here again, and I want to use that same idea of an even interval as much as possible. So I'm not going to come up on a point, I'm going to come up midway through a line, and I'm going to come up right on the edge where the fabric meets the background. So I'm coming straight up here, and then I'm going to go down straight into the fabric, and instead of pulling the thread, so I'm going to show you here what I could do is pull this all the way through, but then I'm kind of like blindly stabbing at the back to figure out where I want to come up next. So instead of doing it that way, I'm going to angle down, and I'm trying to match the length of the stitch there, and then I'm going to fold the fabric so that I can see right where my needle is going to come up for the next stitch. This really cuts down on how long it takes as well. Don't be afraid if you're not liking the result to cut out your stitches and start again. But also know that the more stitches that you add, the less the individual variation will be visible. So once you've finished whip stitching around the edges of your shape, I just wanted to show making a knot. You want to make sure you leave enough thread to be able to make your knot easily, so it's not a struggle. You're going to go through and pick up just a little bit. This is maybe 1/8 of an inch of the batting, and you're going to pull your needle most of the way through until you have a loop right here, and then you're going to go through that loop 2 times and then pull it tight. I like to do that 2 times. Make another 1/8 of an inch stitch, go through your loop twice. Now if you go through your loop in opposite directions, you'll go back out of your loop, so don't do that. And then finally, to finish, instead of cutting your thread off right there at the knot, you're going to go back into your batting and just slide your needle along the inside of your batting, pull it through, and then snip off there. And that tucks in your ends and just stabilizes your piece. The third technique that I wanted to show is something called couching. And what couching allows you to do is really draw with your thread. I'm going to use this heavier boucle, cotton boucle. It's a 2-ply, and I'm going to split it, so I'm just working with 1 ply. And you don't have to use a really thick thread like this, but this is a way to use a thick thread without having to try and stitch through your fabric. So for this, I'm going to continue to use my contrasting red thread so that you're able to see how the stitches look, but you don't have to. In fact, if you use a matching thread, then you really are just noticing the line of the couched fabric. So this is the fabric, the thread that you're couching, and this is what you're couching it with. I'm going to keep this shape really freeform for now. To start, I'm going to come up from the back, pretty close to the end, but not right at the end of my fabric. And then I'm just going to wrap over, and like I did before, instead of pulling the thread all the way down, I'm going to go ahead and come up where I want the next stitch to begin. I'm going to hold down that end until it's successfully grabbed. Just like with your running stitch, you can experiment with the interval. Most likely you'll want it to be even, but you can vary it purposefully to create more emphasis with the lines coming closer together or further apart. I'm going to continue down around to create a loose circle. And finally, I just wanted to come in and show how you can use a contrasting thread to create more visual interest. This is also a great way to create a gradient by changing the color of your contrasting thread as you move across your shape. These 3 stitches, couching, the running stitch, and the whip stitch, are just the tip of the iceberg. Look up the back stitch, the French knot, the satin stitch, or just stick with these 3 because you can really, they have a lot of expressive potential just sticking with these. If you'd like to follow along with my work, you can find me on Instagram at Carolyn Hazel Drake or at my website www.carolynhazeldrake.com. Look forward to more workshops and opportunities to connect in the future.